jacked.
That's terrible, I'm sorry.
We'll edit that out.
Photoshop me. Arnold Schwarzenegger's body. All right, so but before we get started, does anyone here know Anurag Argwal? 2 people. All right, he issued a challenge, 3, and said that I can't find any information about his family. He said he'd come and work for me for free, so if you happen to find out any information about his family, please let me know. There's something for you. I just don't know what it is yet.
Does it have to be true?
Social engineering.
It does have to be true, and it can't just be his family's Indian.
You're supposed to be doing technical hacking, not social engineering.
All right, so my name is Robert Hansen. Most of you probably know me as RSnake. I run hackers.org, slackers.org, the hackers.org forum. If you don't, does anyone not know what that is? Anyone? Okay, good. I don't need to talk about that. This tiny little web application network security consulting company out of Austin, Texas. Do a lot of browser security stuff, help out VCs and stuff. I'm not going to worry about that. All right. So I wanted to preface this whole thing by explaining that I'm not trying to sit here and tell you this is the world's best speech or anything. And I want to preface this because I think it's really important. It's a quote from 1996. Frames have horrible usability since they break most of the navigation features in a web browser. Bookmarks, backtrack, and going to a URL all stop working. And the reason why I think this is important is it's sort of a history lesson. Does that remind you of cross-site or XML HTTP request? We have all the same things happen twice. And I'm not trying to say that everything that we've come up with is now fixed. I'm not saying that anything I'm coming up with now won't be fixed. I'm not saying I'm smarter than anyone in the audience. I'm just saying these are some interesting things that kind of take us through the landscape of where we've been, where we're going. So, competing protocols. There was Gopher and HTTP. And the reason why HTTP won out for the most part is that it was a lot more flexible. A lot of people to put in images, do something more dynamic with their websites. It wasn't just static hyperlinks, which is pretty attractive. It gives you that air of flexibility. So eventually it won out, right? This is the internet that we know. It's www. Graphical browsers as a whole. Acquisition, just Spyglass license. This is the area that I came in. This is the internet that I know. Yes, it was around a lot before that, but if someone says I've been around the security world for 30 years, they're not talking about what we're talking about. It's a different area of security. So really, this is when the internet really took off in the way that we know and use it today. 1995 comes out with JavaScript. Working for Netscape comes out with it. It's a really useful tool. We all know and love it. It's got lots of problems. But eventually it starts getting supported in a lot of other places. Microsoft introduces VBScript in 1996. It's not widely adopted. It's widely adopted in the sense that Internet Explorer is widely adopted, but it's not picked up by the other browser companies because it's proprietary and they've already got JavaScript, which means that JavaScript wins. So here are some of the threats. Here's what people were thinking about back then. There's no session state management. There's no way for me to tell that this user is the same user as the user that comes in 10 seconds later with the same IP address. There's just no way to do that. It's not encrypted. There's no way for me to actually do secure transactions over the web. It only supports basic authentication, which isn't good for state management. It's pretty good for sending username and password back and forth. Really no way to know that they're different except by looking at their IP addresses if they're different. And most importantly, the UI was horrible. This is probably the most important part of this, and this is why it never got any sort of level of adoption other than when you're kind of hard up for a real authentication system. If your developers can't, come on guys, sit down. Hey, that means you. It's one of those types of slots. So the UI was terrible, and this is really important because all the developers for web applications suddenly decided, well, we have this formalized way to do authentication on the web, but it just doesn't work for us because we can't brand it. It's really hard to tell where it's coming from. It's ugly. It makes a sound. I mean, it's just about the worst UI you can possibly come up with. So around 1994, Netscape. We were all sort of laughing about it at the time, but it actually did its job. We sort of felt like the web was a secure place once that was implemented. Web developers were told to create their own credentials. It's actually part of an RFC. Use secure cookies. So basically, the internet at large basically said, okay, now you got to roll your own authentication system. It's sort of on you to do that, and that comes up quite a bit later, actually. 1999 brought HTTP 1.1. And most important from a security perspective was the digest-based authentication. So digest fixed only one problem, and that is the ability for me to kind of, in certain cases, not tell people what my password is if they're in Manaville, but not in all cases. So yeah, that was sort of a good thing, except for it didn't actually solve the one problem it was intending to solve, and it didn't fix any of the UI issues that we had with it initially. So from 2000 era, and the big problems then were we realized it was allowed to contact anything. That initially sounded like a really good idea. Then we started realizing, hey, maybe that's not such a good thing with process request forgeries. So we started talking about it a little bit. There was no way to easily upgrade your browser. There wasn't the automatic update systems that we're used to. You kind of had to download stuff on your own, apply your own patches. It was kind of a pain. Cross-domain policy issues. Microsoft came out with the not just talking about cross-site scripting there, oops, sorry. But there was a whole, if you guys remember umbrella.name, this is a long time ago. A lot of you guys probably weren't really in this field back then, but umbrella.name and HP Equib and those guys, they were developing on a regular basis ways to break browsers. It was happening, if you were on the mailing list back then, about once a week they'd come out with something new and dangerous, especially for Internet Explorer. There were lots of exploits, and get malware on your machine. And that was a big problem because there was no update mechanisms to get your patches applied easily. So this is HTML Toady. This is what I like to say is the kind of the fundamental reason why you can't just do pattern matching on the web. The browser is just way too flexible. This is a picture of MySpace trying to protect themselves from getting search engine optimization spam. So they're basically changing every I for iPhone, iPod, anything else that they think is spam into ... So it changed every single I on the entire page into ... which obviously doesn't really work for consumers. The comment here, I don't know why MySpace ate my eyes, however I think it's kind of cute. If you think of it as a giant hangman game, patience with technology. So users are kind of dealing with our mistakes because browsers are pretty flexible. Does anyone here read HTML?
What does that mean?
Like actually understand HTML? Yeah. Yeah. You. All right. You're my guinea pig. What does that say?
Nice.
Text.
It says hi Owasp. So there's an H, a bunch of garbage. There's an I. This is basically saying turn the middle part into white. That I is I'm using an I instead of a space. This video right to left tag basically reads the opposite direction. So OWA garbage S P exclamation point. So the point here is how can we find fraud if I can't even, as someone who can read HTML, tell you what that says? I mean, I have the same problem. I don't feel bad for this guy. We're all in the same boat, right? I can't just look at that and tell you what it says. And if I can't programmatically create something that emulates the browser and all browsers in whatever way that obfuscation works, how am I ever going to be able to detect the kind of fraud that eBay or MySpace tries to protect themselves from? So MIME types, it's a lot of people brought this up, and I kind of think it's not an issue, but it also is an issue. So this is me outputting something in text plain. In Internet Explorer, it renders. In Firefox, it does not render, as it should not, because I'm putting text plain instead of HTML. HTML, JS, and CSS differences. If you ever actually try to code an application using a lot of CSS and JavaScript, you'll notice very quickly that they do not do well across platform. You can get it working right out of the box, but it's going to be a lot of cache tries. Proprietary URL structure. This is a Firefoxism. If you have like square brackets around an IP address, for instance, it'll go there in Firefox. Don't know why, just works. And that kind of stuff makes it really hard for me to detect what a URL is. There's all kinds of different ways to obfuscate URLs. Proprietary protocols, PDP in the back, I see him like that. Yeah. Wave your hand, PDP. Data directive and various other protocols are all proprietary. And I don't think I've found too many that you can't do something bad with. And that's a bad thing because they're not standard between the two browsers, or the two major browsers, or definitely not standard between all browsers, and et cetera. There's lots of other things that are different between the browsers. So users' concerns in the early 2000s, a little bit different than technology concerns. They were worried that you could compromise the desktop. That was one of the #1 things. They were worried that people were going to get their malware on the computer because it's happening all the time. The use of stuff like double cookie malware, being able to track them across the internet, was all over the press. Everyone's all really very concerned about the privacy issues back then. Being able to spoof the location bar, if you know your phishing history, that was that whole thing that they pop up on top of Chrome. Phishing and identity theft in general, they didn't have to use that, they just steal credentials. So this is a picture of me testing a zero-day that I never ever released. Basically, I was able to spoof any page I wanted. So in this case, eBay and Earthlink and WebCaller ID, and I forget which one this is, all thought I was on eBay. And clearly I was not on eBay. So XHTML came out of WAP, if you know your mobile history. And in about 2001, that no one's ever going to implement. The solution was we want to be able to protect ourselves from that whole HTML totem thing. We want to be able to detect what's going on the page. But the problem is it suffers from all the same reasons we moved away from Gopher in the first place. It's really inflexible. It makes it really hard for programmers to quickly generate something on the fly and kind of spit out pseudocode and just make it work kind of thing. It makes it much more structured. At least not anytime in the near future. Firefox implements port blocking, which is a pretty cool way to restrict some of the bad things that can happen. Unfortunately, they also allow lots of other ways to do that same bypassing the port restrictions. It allows users to quickly clean history and cookie data. Unfortunately, it didn't make this a default on option. You have to go and configure it, and studies have shown that almost no one filters are built in. Finally, it took a number of years for this to get ramped up. Firefox actually could have beat Internet Explorer to the market by 2 years if they had listened to me, but they kind of just didn't think it was something that consumers want. They didn't want to add it in. Internet Explorer beat them to the game by about a year, and finally they just decided to bite the bullet and do it. But this is really important because it finally allowed consumers to protect themselves, where before they were just telling them to look at the location, all this other stuff, which wasn't working because there were so many exploits out there. Browsers begin to auto-update. That's probably the biggest win because now all that zero-day stuff that was coming out right and left is finally kind of dealt with. I mean, yes, it's still a problem. Yes, there's exploits, but it's getting updated pretty regularly. So now we have to worry about architectural problems. Forget the 0 days. Those are important, sure, but they're largely dealt with, and they're dealt with for the most part pretty quickly. Sometimes a couple months, but for the most part pretty quickly. With the exception. What? Because they're using the old Gecko rendering engine from whatever the last update they pulled in from. So Netscape went from being a very, very popular, widely used application to being practically non-existent on the radar. And as a result, they stopped spending a lot of money on the rendering engine, got rid of it, and now they just rebrand other people's stuff. Sorry if you use them. So Sammy Worm, Sammy's going to be doing steal his thunder or anything, but he went. He basically took malware from doing 100 to 200,000 people infections to over 1 million in under 24 hours. So order of magnitude difference, which finally brought us back in the realm. Okay, browsers really do need to start thinking about this, where they really. I don't think everyone really. I mean, I think we all knew it was possible, but I think he kind of proved it. Did all of us a big favor, by the way, made us all have jobs. Several years ago, I was working for a big telco, huge telco actually, and I figured that you could probably hack the internet through a browser, which I thought was pretty cool. I mean, I've been studying web AppSec for a long time, but I figured out through the use of looking glasses, basically one misconfiguration in that looking glass, I could pretty much take out about a third of the internet. Because some of these major telcos kind of control like all the transatlantic. So I was thinking about like ways to do that. Jeremiah started talking at Owasp conference, and we kind of got on the topic of internet port hacking, and he went off and built it, and now we have the ability to break the internet from the inside of the firewall. Browser history theft. So this is one that both Jer and I have been kind of harping on for a while now. It's something that's fairly easy to fix. Unfortunately, it has a bad usability impact, which is that little link and it changes color. That would have to go away for this to really, really work. Basically, you can steal your history. Exponential XSS, it's not a myth, it actually happened. It was the Jutsu Worm. It was a very small-scale worm across 3 different Italian web servers, but basically instead of SAMI, which is all on one web server, which is not totally true because he did have to shift domains, it was mostly on one web server. This was on 3 completely different platforms. So this is possible. It's not, he was able to get it to work, but it never had the wide-scale propagation. Desktop compromises in Google Desktop because of the integration with the web. So the browser is sort of an artifact of the problem that Google is intercepting traffic and doing something weird with it and having vulnerabilities. The PDF universal XSS exploits, there's a whole bunch of them. Anyway. So 2007 goes retro. So we decided to go back in time and take JavaScript. We can do the CSS history attack again, and we can do cross-site request forgery, which we're always able to do. That was a pretty easy one. Non-HTTPS updates over browsers. So we realized suddenly that all that stuff, the reason why it had SSL in the first place was to protect ourselves from man in the middle. But all of a sudden, we can do all that same dorky stuff, like getting in the middle of the session and basically owning your browser, because your browser's making, especially in Firefox, makes updates over HTTP, especially for the toolbar, like Google Toolbar, for instance, Yahoo Toolbar. Internet hacking through split VPN tunnels. We thought split VPN tunnels were gone as of 10 years ago. They're everywhere. Everyone's still using them. We knew back then it was a bad idea. It's still a bad idea, but it allows us to basically write sessions back into the internet and hack using JavaScript. So browsers, the conduit for all this. They're the ones that are allowing all this to happen. HTTP only becomes a standard in 2007, sorta. Internet Explorer came out way, way, way before that, but finally Firefox picks up the ball. Unfortunately, it's not really totally a standard. It never really could be a standard because it still breaks things like old web TV, I know you guys care, and IE 5.0 on Mac. Yeah, I know. So Firefox kind of has this reaction where they said they can fix any vulnerability in 10 fucking days. And I don't harp on Firefox too much about the Mozilla guys about this. They got a lot of bad press, but honestly, I think they had all the best. And to their credit, I think that what they were talking about was the browser-based exploits, mostly buffer overflows, string compare issues, or whatever. I don't care about that. And in fact, that's kind of not relevant because we have that patching thing. What I'm concerned about is the stuff that's architecturally wrong. So this is our current and unfortunate business rules that we have to abide by. We cannot encrypt everything because we don't own everything. So if I run a website, if I run MySpace, I don't necessarily own files or whatever. They're all over the net. I can't just encrypt all the data. It's too expensive, computationally expensive. It requires a huge investment in hardware. We must allow rich HTML because consumers demand it. They really want to have all that annoying music stuff all over their website and flashing baby dancing crap, That's horrible. So we can't fix all the cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery holes just because there's too many. People are going to say cheering because, yes, this does mean you need a WAF or something, but don't get ahead of yourself. See?
Pop out.
It's not, though. I said no. Our employees must use the same, meaning all browsers, as the people who visit our website. And there's really no good way to do, right now, to do privilege separation between my browser connecting to the web and my browser connecting to the internet. Would be talking about as far as internet hacking. We can't block on IP addresses. This is the most common thing I see in security today. People say, yeah, I'll just block the IP address and blah, 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 blah. all that does is prove to the bad guy that you know what they're doing wrong and makes them shift. They're like, okay, no way. So that's what this is how they caught me. I just won't do that. And what's the number one thing you learn as a script kiddie when you're in that IRC channel and that guy boots you out? Okay, well, get over. And every time we do this, we're basically giving the bad guys information about how our security works. Really terrible tactic. So today's big browser threats. These are the big buckets. I'll get into them in a second. Cross-domain leakage, same-site or cross-site request forgery, de-anonymization. This is one that's coming up over and over again. I'll get into the details in a second. Identity theft, fraud. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. Depends on what we're talking about. Party plugins and toolbars, which I probably won't be discussing a whole lot just because I only got 40 minutes. But that includes stuff like Grease Monkey. There's a whole bunch of toolbars out there that are very, very insecure. That's actually how I think someone's going to be talking about Flash security tomorrow. That's actually how someone almost hacked me, but they were not successful. So cross-domain leakage. So this includes cross-site scripting, of course, has to be number one. Yay. It's 91. Anyway, it's somewhere in there. It's big. The number's large. Refers are sent, accepted in some cases, file colon, meta, over SSL, a couple of other situations. Anyway, it leaks information about your internal networks out to the world. At Black Hat this year, I kind of did a demonstration about who's leaking data to me, just to totally sanitize the data. And some very, very big companies that should know better are leaking information about their internal networks. Status bar, this is a little known thing. If you have a status bar, it's changing because some page that you're iframing or something outputs some sensitive data in that status bar. Firefox, you can pull that information from the other frame. Remote CSS, JS, Flash, Java, all that stuff can be pulled in from the other website. It doesn't have to stay on that website. In fact, it's intended to be pulled in to other websites. CSS history. All leak information about images on other websites, whether they're there or not there. So you can fingerprint web servers, which gives you information, especially if it's blind, where it's behind a firewall and you can't actually see that data. It gives you a lot of interesting information. XML errors, this is something Jeremiah came up with to detect if people are logged in or not. It works great. Timing attacks, there's a number of different ways to do timing attacks to know if something is loaded or not loaded. I'm not going to get into that one at all, but there was a new thing that came out. I blogged about it a couple days ago that affects NTLM. Basically, you can still NTLM information over the internet using DNS revive. Cross-domain policy.xml and Flash allows you to know information about the cross-domain. There's another one coming out for cross-domain XML HTTP requests, which I'll talk about a little bit.
Robert, you have 50 more minutes. You have plenty of time.
50?
You have 50 more minutes.
Okay. All right, well, slow down.
Lots of questions.
Take a deep breath.
All right, you have till 4:40.
Okay, well, I thought I had 40 minutes.
You have an hour 10.
Oh, sweet. All right.
See, this room full of guys are really interested. Give you a lot of time.
All right, well, feel free to jump in with questions if you guys have good questions. So, cross-site, same-site request forgeries. There's just a number of different ways to basically force your browser to go connect somewhere else. And I just really love it. It's actually how Google Desktop, one of the tricks in how you could actually execute .exe files on the local file system or bash files or whatever was by using essentially that concept where you can hover something underneath the mouse pointer. When you click on it, you're actually clicking in a frame that's doing something beneath you. Client-side applications, there's a ton of them. I'm not going to get into those, but a lot of Flash objects, anything that's XML HTTP request. And this is an interesting story. Jeremiah and myself and PDP and somebody else, I can't remember, maybe it was just the three of us, right? About the XML HTTP request. The cross-domain was talking with Daniel Veditz at Mozilla about this. And basically our theory was, he's like, does this introduce any new vulnerabilities? And with the exception of one, really all this. You haven't fixed all these other problems. Yeah, I mean, theoretically you're adding one more, but really your attack posture hasn't changed at all. All this other stuff needs to get fixed before we even consider even worrying about this. The attack as a percentage is going to be almost 0 compared to the simple image tag. Redirection of URLs. This is a really tricky one because let's say I actually do some work and I actually go and validate that some web server is actually hosting. Doing anything weird, there's nothing bad there, it's no GDI plus exploit or anything like that. And then 10 seconds later, it turns into a redirection 302 or 301 redirection and points back to the same website and does some cross-site request forgery. So there's no way for me to know for a fact that anything on the web is what it is. We can change it to do something malicious, even with something as simple as an image tag remotely. De-anonymization. There's just tons and tons and tons of ways to do this.
Bomb squad.
Cookies, flash cookies. Flash cookies are probably most prevalent. The place that you're going to find them, and by the way, you can't just, if you click delete cookies, I don't know if you guys know this or not, it doesn't delete the flash cookies. Where you're going to find the majority of your flash cookies coming from is like YouTube. You're going to see it on SiteKey. There's a couple other websites that try to track information about you using flash cookies for the purpose of people like probably most of us who delete cookies on. Browser caching. There's a way looking at eTag. The eTag basically is just a long string that's basically a base64 encoded string, sort of looking. But basically, if you make that unique for every single user that comes in, you basically turn that thing into a cookie. As long as they don't clear their cache, it's persistent. So you don't have to set a cookie. You don't like a little pop-up that says, "Or you want to allow this cookie." You don't have to do that. IE persistence. It's a little known trick in IE, but you can do persistent tags. If anyone wants to know how to do it, I'll tell you. It's a little too complicated to go in here. Machine fingerprinting. There's a whole slew of different ways to do that in JavaScript, which may or may not give you some information. I published something at TourCon a couple of months ago or whatever about some interesting ways to do that. Some sort of tool called Mr. P. TCP timing gives you information. This isn't specifically the browser, but it's just another way. IP address. I can tell that they're different because of the TCP timing stuff. CSS history refers to a recurring theme. It leaks information over the web. Offline enabled apps. This is an interesting one. This will be in Firefox 3. I don't know if Internet Explorer has plans to do this or not. But basically, this allows companies like Google to persist data on your machine. So let's say I'm using like Google Mail, for instance, and I'm writing something, and I go on a business trip, and I'm still in the middle of writing this very long, important email, and I don't want to lose it, and I don't want to send it either. Theoretically, I can use this offline enabled app to store that data on my machine persistently until I'm ready to do something with it, which essentially allows companies like Google to persist data forever if they want to on your drive.
Going back, what was special about CSS history?
You can,
From the normal history.
in normal history.
And what's special about CSS history?
Oh, you're using a CSS history hack to pull the history.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, which I can give you tons of examples of how it works. Jeremiah built some, PDP's built some, I've built some. So Java sockets and Tor, this is a big thing that the Metasploit guys worked on a lot, I've worked on a lot. And it's basically a way for you to basically leak the information about your real IP addresses. So if you think Tor is safe, not only was it the way that people stole 100 MSC passwords and 70,000 MySpace user accounts and whatever else, but it's also vulnerable to give your real IP address if you allow Java sockets. Statistical observation or man-in-the-middle attacks allow a client on either side, if you have some access to see what's going on the client, you get to know stuff about, so let's say a user comes in and 10 seconds later another user comes into that same page and it's kind of an obscure page. One of two things happen. They send it to a friend, or someone bookmarked it for some random reason, or it's the same guy using the proxy. So identity theft. Phishing on remote domains is probably the most obvious one. We're all pretty familiar with that one. XSS phish on whitelisted sites. This does happen. It's not theoretical. I built the cheat sheet for a reason. That's why. MySpace with a Cyrillic M. Someone was selling that for $1 million. Basically to phish users. That's coming back in style. I actually saw something about that a couple weeks ago. Credential theft in general, whether that be through XSS or man-in-the-middle or whatever. Embedded basic auth. This is a kind of a tricky one. I've seen it a couple times, and usually it's accidental. People don't even realize they're doing it. Someone will embed an image to a remote domain reason one day, and all of a sudden, the page that had the embedded image on it will suddenly start popping up that basic auth dialog. So people are like, oh, my username and password. Type. And well, so that's not that big a deal if they do it inadvertently, because they're probably not logging that information. They're probably just logging the username. But if you use like modauth external or have a packet sniffer or something, you easily pick that information up. So CSS overlay. This is one of the most common ways for people to phish people on MySpace. This is kind of going away a little bit with some of the stuff that they're putting in, trying to make it so you can't put in forms that have password type. But ultimately, it's not going to stop anything. DNS farming. I've only seen this happen maybe 2 or 3 times now total, but it does happen. People are able to hack into the DNS server. There's a whole bunch of exploits in Bind. I know Amit Klein's working on some of those. But basically, you know, you're going to a website. You think you're going to one website, you end up on another one. Keystroke logging malware. This is probably the biggest way that this is actually working. I was actually at an invite-only malware conference a couple of weeks ago, and we spent a lot of time talking about this exact topic. It's very prevalent. It's very easy to do. A lot of it comes into the browser. Some of it's through email, of course, but a lot of it's HTML, which we already talked about. Password manager hijacking. This is probably one of my favorite because it's just so stupid. You know, a user goes to a website, it's XSS'd in some way, and instead of having to phish the credentials, I don't even necessarily have to show them the web page. I could just have it hit an iframe or whatever, and populate that same information, the username and password on it. And the password manager, thankfully, automatically populates with the username and password. And then all I do is steal that information. So Firefox try to protect themselves by saying, all right, well, if it's the same action, if you're trying to submit to the same place, then you're allowed to populate. If not, then you're not. Well, that's pretty easy. There's about 200 ways in JavaScript to get around that, so not most. So how do we convey the solution to our users? I've kind of got a problem with the way we as a security community communicate our education. I don't think education works at all anyway, but so here's some of the stupid stuff. So like, oh, just turn off JavaScript, right? Just do it. And then contradictorily, we say, okay, use JavaScript for authentication pages. Use it for, you know, anytime you're going to use Google Mail, for instance. Use it anytime that you're doing our special apps. Right? Turn it off everywhere else, but just use it every time we want you to. All right, so that's conflicting. So don't install anything, right? 1,000 times. Just don't install anything off the internet. It's all dangerous. You don't know what it is, whatever. Then we say, use plugins. Go download NoScript. You know, go download the security software. Download the antivirus, whatever. Totally contrary. Don't use social networks. So we say, all right, don't use them. But then we say, okay, well, you can just use separate browsers. All right. Then we say, pick a secure password. So pick the craziest, most hard, complicated password you can possibly come up with. Then don't reuse them. So come up with 50 of them and try to remember all of them. All right, that's going to work. Then we say, type in the URL, which I actually kind of agree with this one. Except then we say, look for the lock. That's the fave icon, right? So, I mean, we tell them to go do something, and then we don't back that up with the actual information on what that actually means or how to do anything with it. So, of course, that lock is supposed to be over here, and Explorer is down there, and it's the fave icon, right? So then we say look for the green bar. And statistics show that people are just confused by that one. Okay, so if it's not green, does that mean it's bad? Right? I don't know. Could be. It doesn't mean anything. And if it is green, does that mean it's good? All right. Okay. So.
Is that one of the demotivators?
Actually, I think it is.
I haven't seen the new ones. That's pretty freaking great.
So wouldn't it be simpler if we could just use a browser and be secure? I mean, that's really what consumers want. They don't want to have to download all this extra crap. They don't want to have to configure their browser in a billion different ways. They don't want to have to think about security at all. They just want to use the internet, be secure. They do want to have all that flexibility. Some suggestions. And this isn't like set in stone. I'm not saying this is the way things have to be. This is just some stuff I've been thinking about. one thing, if you guys know your Star Trek nerddoms here, Spock was trying to destroy a robot who was going to kill him by giving him a logic error. This sentence is a lie. All right? I like his. I like mine better. If you trust me, tell me when I tell you to distrust me. So the old Netscape model was, as of 7 to 8.0, so it kind of went the way that Gecko was, I have this browser and I trust certain websites, like an eBay, like a Microsoft, like whatever, to be a safe site. So I'm going to use the least restrictive settings I possibly can, which in their terms, in their mind, was Internet Explorer with everything turned on. And if it's a kind of a medium tier site where I kind of just don't know what it is, it's not trustworthy, it's just kind of a like scary, it's obviously got a virus on it, it's on the blacklist, use Firefox with the most secure settings you possibly can. And I thought that was great, completely backwards, but great. It's backwards because people who put in all that information onto these dynamic sites need to be protected as much or more than a lot of those other sites that are sort of the middle ground. It should be up to me, the website, to tell the browser, if you trust me, tell me to tell you, don't try my site's insecure, I know this page is insecure, let me turn your settings all the way on. Which is an interesting concept because it puts the onus back onto the websites to do that protection, which is good, right? I'll do that. I'll go out and put in that little meta tag or an XML or X header or whatever it needs to be with meta tag, or I don't know, whatever it looks like. So that could look like two different things. One is on-page sandboxing. So one thing we tried to do at eBay was do an iframe and basically throw everything into another domain. It just didn't work. Tons of users. It just looked awful. Tons of different problems. Screwed up printing in Germany, which is a big deal. I used to work for eBay, for those of you who don't know that. The other one, which I like a lot, so basically on-page sandboxing would be an iframe that's on the page. So instead of me screwing up my search engine optimization, I have everything on the same page. It just can't write to anywhere outside of it. It can't access the DOM. It's just sort of stuck there in its virtual iframe. The second way to do that is content restrictions. 3.5 years ago with Mozilla guys. It was something that I came up with to try to solve a really complex problem, which is that some of the page is good. It's our content. Other page, not so good. We know it's bad. So why don't we tell the browser, look, you can do certain things. You can include this piece of JavaScript, this piece of JavaScript, whatever. This is all good. This and this are good. Everything else, you either can't run JavaScript, or it has to run in sandbox mode, or can't open a new DOM, or can't theoretically possible. I don't know what this thing's going to look like. There's been lots of talk of instantiation. It eventually got passed off to GRF. We got passed off to the WhatWG, and it sort of lived there for 3.5 years. I'm hearing some talk that it might be in Firefox 3.0, but it will probably be very, very quickly. Secured zones. So one of the beauties of Internet Explorer is that it has the concept of zones. Some places are trustworthy, some places are not. Unfortunately, consumers have no clue what that means, and they're never going to configure it. But for large corporate networks, it's actually pretty good, because it doesn't do enough, but it's pretty good. Because a administrator can say, look, I trust this zone to be this level of danger or not, or be able to do these things, or instantiate JavaScript, or run ActiveX controls, or whatever, and not to do that on untrustworthy domains or whatever. That's great, but for internet port hacking, why should the internet zone, RC 1918, or or internet that doesn't have RC 1918, user configured to say, all right, I don't want the internet to be able to make my browser contact RC 1918 space, internal address space. Why? Well, what does it ever need to? If I wanted to, I'll do it myself. Or say, click here, there's a warning, okay, yeah, I do want it to contact my internal address space. Why would I ever want that? I can't think of a single reason other than Google Desktop, which needs to contact 127.0.0.1, which does screw up whitelist something, then blacklist. I don't know, personal. This is kind of a personal problem I've had with the whole refer strategy that browsers have had for the last decade. It's what I call the Forrest Gump refer problem. You really never know what you're going to get. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's got stuff in front of it. It's just bizarre. It's total whatever. It's always been one of those optional headers, but I'd really like to see this thing, a strategy put in place that says, yes, refers are always there or they're always not. I don't care which. I think it needs to be standard. And I actually think this should include things like SSL. I mean, granted, it's going to cause some security problems because people do stupid stuff with URL structure. But the good part about that is it convinces everybody that, yes, referrers are something that are dangerous. They need to be treated as something that's, sometimes they're on, sometimes they're off. If you're using Firefox, it sends the referrer. So Internet Explorer and Firefox haven't even agreed on that much. I like to see this strategy kind of settled between the browsers. Requester context. This is something I've talked on and off with Billy Hoffman about, and I actually think is a really good idea, is the ability for me to get the information about the context in which I am called. So if someone clicks on a link, I want to know that it was a link. If somebody requested my page, I want to know about it, and that allows me to kill a request, not allow cross-site request forgeries. It gives me a lot more context to know that something good or bad is happening. If I'm being called in an iframe, I want to know it's an iframe. I don't necessarily need to know which iframe or what it's named or anything specific about it. I just want to know what context I'm being called in. It allows me to make decisions, secure decisions on my own behalf. APIs. This came out of a conversation. And I thought it was actually a brilliant idea. One of the beauties of all the stuff I've talked about so far is it really kind of puts a lot of that ownership back onto the websites to fix their own problems. Well, there's a lot of vendors out there who would like to fix those problems for the whole web community. They'd love to do it, but they can't because we haven't supplied them as a vendor community with the APIs necessary to make those decisions. So a couple of examples are callbacks. They want to be able to see anything that's whether it's allowed to happen or not allowed to happen. It's pretty simple, right? You'd think that should be an API. Intercept network data. This actually, you'd think this is possible in Firefox. It's actually not. It actually works the other way around. You get to intercept it after it's already gone through. Why is that good? It's not. It doesn't help you. It doesn't allow the vendor to actually make any intelligent decisions and do anything with it. Another one that would be really beautiful is network call to DOM mapping. So if something's making a call to internal address space or whatever, it would be really handy to know where it's being called and how it's being called. So similar to the requester context stuff, except all in an API. It allows the vendors to make a decision on what to do with that stuff. Protected and untainted JavaScript. So on the top of the page, if I've got some JavaScript that makes some security decisions about other JavaScript that's running on the page, why should it ever be overwritten? Shouldn't there be a context where I can say, you cannot overwrite me under any circumstances? And that at least gives me the ability as a website developer to say, look, I've got some security software and it can't be killed. Sure, maybe I've got other holes in the site, but at least that thing is sane. It's not getting overwritten, because JavaScript can overwrite variables. And that's kind of nice. And lastly, and I probably have like 40 minutes left, so lots of questions here, I'm sure, but standardized authentication. So going all the way back full circle to our original discussion, digest and basic authentication. They were a pretty but now we have authentication. It's already built. It kind of works because we've jerry-rigged our own credentials. Why do you think we see so many problems with insufficient tokens and failure to log out and other stuff? Because we've had to roll our own, and we don't know anything about programming. We're not good at it. We just, as a community, we just haven't figured it out. So why don't we, as a vendor community, come up with this concept of a it's got automatic logout. It's got really strong authentication built into it. It's got the ability to skin the thing, because that's one of the web developers' biggest beefs is basic authentication is just a dialog box. I can't skin it, can't make it my own. But give it all the things that we want, but make it secure. Make it as secure as we possibly can between the browser and the web server. So now, I mean, Microsoft owns both the browser and IIS. Those tools necessary to both parties would fix a lot of the insufficient privilege holes that we find in the sites. Holy cow.
That's it, I'm out of this business.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about the website owner protecting the user. What do you think about the user being able to protect themselves against a hostile website?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Repeat the question.
He basically said, what do I think about users being able to protect themselves from hostile internet? I mean, the short answer is absolutely no way. The long answer is yes, and actually I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to browsers. I like pretty much all browsers the same, in that I think they're all they have problems, all of them. And I also think almost all of them can be secured enough in a way where you actually really can't do anything bad, and that's not. Are users actually going to do that? No chance. None. They're not going to do it. Studies that show, I think Microsoft did a pretty thorough study on people who were trying to go through navigation of all the options within IE, and they figured out that like fractions of a percent clicked on some of the options.
Can you go back to your last slide?
Yes, I can.
Not that one. That one. Into that, or is that separate?
Yeah, no, I think it all should be in there.
Okay, good. 'Cause I mean, session management to me seems like an internet is broken problem. I mean, why does everybody and their brother have to? I mean, even though the Java and all these things have a standard, you can just bake it in so it's not vulnerable to all these common problems.
I completely agree.
And I think even take that point to the logical extreme, there are so many things that are broken about having taken all this crap on top of it. I mean, look at this freaking list that you've got. Is there some point where we say, you know what? We know what we're trying to do. We've got a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't now. Did we just throw everything in the garbage and build this thing from scratch now that we know what all the problems are?
That's an interesting thought, and you know, basically the question was, do we throw it all away and start over? And no, I don't think we should throw it all away. I think it's significantly broken right now. But there are some interesting people talk. I actually think it's not a bad idea. Is to create a secure version of the internet for secure transactions. If I don't care about my token, if it's just in MySpace account, I don't use any of the same credentials or whatever. Does that really matter? I mean, it's bad. Sure, they can hack into my webmail. Maybe that's bad. But if I've got some other super ultra secure version of the internet that my browser will not allow any of that context to get leaked in any other way, that can't be exploited in any specific way, there's some interesting value there. Single vendor out there, or every single website, everybody's gonna have to start implementing this thing and building APIs all over again. It's just a major nightmare. But there is some hope there.
So I have this theory, you can tell me if it's pipe dream, but if we get someone like Microsoft as an example, who owns a browser and a framework, to build the parts on both sides that could work. I mean, obviously they could build that to be backwards compatible with what we have today, but they could allow some sites
never caused any
to
problem.
be secure. And so some guy said, look, you can only use IE version 10 or whatever this site requires. But some people have a model. They'd say, oh, well, you actually can do that. And then I would hope that would encourage people to move towards
But,
that.
I mean, if you think about it, a lot of websites are forcing you to do weird things. So they're forcing you to turn on JavaScript, or they're forcing you to use certain browsers, or they're forcing you to download some Java applet, or bizarre stuff that's way outside the normal trust model. Like, wow, are you sure you really want me to do that? But I mean, I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. Yes, they could build all that stuff. Yes, I think EV Search is a really good example of that. EV Search solved one problem really poorly, and it was deployed almost nowhere. And yeah, a couple of sites are that much more.
I believe that the companies that really, really care, like the large financials, the guys with the huge risks, might go there. They might,
Well,
it might
they
be
would.
slightly inconvenient for their users,
They
but
would.
the increase in security for them is worth it to try it.
They would.
Right? And so they could serve as like the beacon of hope for the rest of the internet. And eventually, 20 years later, some big chunk of it might have migrated towards that.
Yes.
Right? Now, it still has to be flashy and cool and have all this crap like you showed at the front. That's the problem.
It's funny you mentioned Flash.
But I mean, that's sort of a fundamental issue we have to deal with. And I agree that users won't use sites that don't have all this cool stuff.
They'll leave. It's interesting. I was actually on a cab ride over here, and some guy was talking about, I don't use PayPal because of all the phishing attacks. And Michael Barrett was talking about, people will actually leave the site, and a lot of people think that's kind of FUD, like. So we need to do something to get them to the point where at least they feel like it's unlikely that they're going to get exploited. And granted, that's a phishing problem, spam, whatever, but still, it's a problem. We need to do something about it.
So I have a CSRF question. You talked about on your request or context, for example, giving the site the ability to try to help make decisions based on the nature of the request.
Mm-hmm.
But don't you think it's fundamentally broken that browsers include session tokens cross-domain like that in the first place?
Depends on what you're talking about. So sometimes I need that information. Sometimes, let's see a really good example.
They need your session token to come with an image
Depends on what you
request
define
and
as a
another
session token. Sometimes the cookie is just a tracking cookie, like DoubleClick, for instance. If DoubleClick wasn't able to do that, the world would fall over, right? Nothing would happen. But for them, their business model would be severely impacted.
But couldn't you have a flag on the cookie that says something like, I'm this kind of cookie and I don't want to be cross-domain, right? Kind of like HTTP only. Like, I'm a kind of cookie that goes across the network and I don't want JavaScript to touch me, right? So even if you didn't force it, if you could give this cookie creator the option to say, hey, I'm this kind of cookie and please protect me better than the DoubleClick cookie. So you could, I think, you could come up with a way.
That's called secure, right?
No, not necessarily.
Well, it
Requires SSL all the time, which maybe
which
that's how they
theoretically
want
you
to
should
work.
only be doing if you're doing a sensitive transaction. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could jerry rig all these things over again. You're gonna have all the same problems over again. I don't think you're actually solving the actual problem.
I
which
think
is
the
that
problem
people
with
do these things.
CSRF protections is that cross-site scripting, which is on every site, invalidates every single CSRF solution that we have.
Oh, I get that.
That's the fundamental promise.
Well, if you have stored cross-site scripting,
No,
you're
It doesn't have to be
It
stored.
doesn't have to be stored.
It can be reflected.
Well,
Reflected can make an XML HTTP request back, pull all that information about the nonce or whatever you're looking for, that special extra thing, and send it off. HTML, HTTP only cookies theoretically are secured from this, in that JavaScript isn't able to access them directly, but XML HTTP request.
I know.
The only caveat to that, and I think this is a really important one for people who don't know about that issue, is that is only true on places that set cookies. It's not true on all pages because you're not sending the data, you're actually getting it back. So it's only a few places where that's actually true. But.
Now, you said SSL. If you set the secure flag on a cookie, you think that's going to stop a CSRF?
No. Not unless you're using SSL for that transaction.
But it's a similar kind of concept.
I mean, why would it matter?
You can't. I'm just, the parallels were uncanny. I mean, I think you're creating all the same problems over again. It's not actually solving the problem.
Well, I mean, a lot of times if you don't solve the problem, at least you get rid of 80% of it. It helps. But obviously, it's nice to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Do we actually need new technology to stop CSRF?
You mean as opposed to like Nonces?
Yeah. And it seems like everything you suggested you can pretty much do today. XSS is really hard. But CSRF seems like a problem you can solve if you care.
Yeah, but that solution mostly solves it by having every developer in the world solve it. I'm looking for the solution where the 6 browser vendors solve it. Or
I think that problem is fundamentally a server problem. So trying to tell the browser vendors solve this CSRF problem, maybe you can do it that way. But I mean, there's so many things you would want to put into a framework anyway that these guys have enough problems to fix as it is. Let them work on the stuff that's fundamentally absolutely a client-side problem, and you got to have you got to have transactional security on the server side no matter what. You're never going to want to trust the client for that. So as part of the framework, absolutely, you don't want 1 million developers rewriting a transactional security model, but you do want it on the server side.
I mean, I agree we want the server side guys to do things, but right? How many browser vendors do we have? 6 or whatever. So as much as we can, I want to leverage the place where it's the smaller community, right? And both sides have a role to play, clearly, but I'm always looking for the place where I get the most leverage, right?
What about the web server vendors then? Or application server vendors? I mean, that's just a bigger group, but still.
I totally agree. They need to help too.
Well, and there seems to be reticence from the browser makers to work on some of these things, like on the on-page sandboxing. I know, like in the Mozilla Bugzilla, like there was a lot of argument from the Mozilla developers like that. I don't know. I never quite understood why they
felt
considered that
it
a bad
was
idea.
hard.
So that reminds me of the question I wanted to ask. So, can you share what your experience has been like trying to work with the browser vendors to get some of this stuff solved, and why?
Somewhat. I'm under
why
NDA
are
for
they-
some things, but the short of it is it has been far harder working with Firefox than any other browser. Far harder. I think the problem with them as an organization is they really have a forward momentum. They are trying to compete with Internet Explorer in the space. They're trying to roll out a ton of features, and unless they can convince some product manager somewhere that they're going to get X% more population of the internet by fixing something, they're not going to do it. So unless it's crazy all over the news, they're going to. And some things I've been talking that they could have fixed 3+ years ago, they just haven't. Some things I brought to their attention, they say, yeah, it's a great idea, and nothing. I mean, not a word after that.
Is that because you're one little guy in the universe, or did we need
I'm
bigger
not that little in
megaphones
this
to yell at
universe,
them,
unfortunately.
right?
But in my opinion, generally, they have been much more resistant in the short term. I think long term, they have all the best intentions. It's just been very hard to get them to tactically finish anything that they've set their mind to in the terms of security. How long did it take them to fix HTML?
Yeah, I know.
2 years.
No. It's 5.
No,
So it's like a 2001 or 2 feature.
Yeah.
was it?
Yeah, it's a long
I thought they were
time.
talking about 2 years. All right, 5 years.
Right.
5 years to fix something that they always wanted.
Now, I mean, so is that a resource thing? I mean, obviously, the resources they have available today are vastly larger than they had 2 years ago or 3 years ago, right? Because they made, what, $65 million last year. What are they doing with all that money, right? So,
Ask
they
me.
can hire everybody in this room probably, and we can all work on the problem.
They do still seem to respond to a lot of bugs on the Bugzilla saying, well, yeah, if you have a patch, go ahead and spin it, but otherwise.
That was actually some of the feedback I got from them as well. They were like, this is great technology. We're completely on board with everything you're saying. Feel free to submit any data you want. Submit a patch, we'll include it. I don't have time to do that. And in fact, I'm one of the world's worst programmers. There's no way I could do that. Not any way that anyone here would be happy about.
So I gotta believe with the funding that they've got available that they should be able to be more responsive. I mean, they obviously have a huge interest in making the internet safe, right? Just like Microsoft and anyone else, right?
It's time input versus, the bottom line.
Yeah.
If it takes me,
They're a nonprofit. What's their bottom line?
they make $65 billion
How
last
to
year.
spend all their money?
If I
They're a joint
spend,
public, not all of them is nonprofit.
Right.
They split it up.
if
in a
half
very
my
interesting
developers
way.
spend,
Really?
6 months fixing the bugs that, Robert brings up today, and they get, 3 more people, that's wasted money.
Well, I would like to have Owasp establish a relationship with them.
Yeah, and
see if we
actually,
can
that's
get some
something I should
progress.
probably mention. Dennis Cruz has been talking about some others, specifically someone from Microsoft and Firefox, hopefully to help contribute on ways that we can help come up with a standard that we all agree is the right way to move forward. No bias, just this is best practice. We need to fix these problems because they're starting to surface themselves more and more. I think some of the things I brought up are largely theoretical, and I don't want to say these are the attacks of the future or anything. I'm not here prophesizing, but I definitely think some of these things are happening a lot. I see them all the time. Some of the things I've helped construct I've never seen, so we need to prioritize, and I think that comes from an unbiased group.
One of the things on your blog that was interesting to a lot of people is how you almost got owned.
Yeah.
You don't want to tell that story?
Go read the blog.
Go read the blog.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would be interested in sort of like a prioritized or order of all that stuff to what are you seeing?
And the other thing I wanted to stress was that list was not a complete list.
Right.
I by no means documented every single vulnerability in any of those groups. That was just what I came up with the top of my head in about 20 minutes. So I'm sure there's probably double, triple that, no problem. Just depends.
Now, do you have most of that stuff documented on your website?
We have
In
the
various
70. We have a lot.
In various forms, yeah. Yes.
And a couple, is there a way to not
Java allows you to do it, or just go into your settings in the browser and turn off Java.
Quick Java, is that a plugin?
Go download something.
So I wonder if part of the solution is to not make everything backward compatible back to web TV and the rest of that kind of thing. I mean, you've said several times that you know, consumers will have a fit. You'll drive them away if you don't allow them to have all of this, you know, dancing babies and all that. I mean, we've done all kinds of things. We said no more leaded gasoline in cars. People had a fit about it, but it was a safety issue. And we said tough shit. You can't do that. Why can't we do the same thing here? Why can't people stand up and say you're not allowed to use stuff that's not safe?
Okay, so before we go on, let me just make sure everyone understands. When I said it doesn't work, HTTP only doesn't work in those browsers, what I mean is it actually crashes the browser. It doesn't answer. And the second part is we can, right? We can tell them, like, you must use, I've seen all over the place, you must use JavaScript to use this application, or you must download this applet, or whatever. We put a line in the sand. We're telling consumers that it's okay to download these applications off the web, and that's our policy. I'm not saying it's a good one, but that's what we've decided as a community, that you're supposed to do these things to interact with our websites. We can make any distinction, no matter how our users to use it, because ultimately we're in control of that. I don't advocate that, but you could do it all.
Why not? I mean, that's, I guess, what I'm saying. I mean, obviously any website can do what they want, but I mean, why doesn't eBay just say, look, you can't, it's not safe to use our site if you're on web TV.
I'll tell you
Stop
exactly
doing
why.
it.
Because the next door neighbor to one of the board of directors uses web TV. I'm not kidding. That's not a story. That's true.
That's a good answer.
Damn it. Yeah.
So 5 years ago, there's a big uproar about privacy and cookies and tracking and that kind of stuff. So Microsoft, who at the time had about a 90% market share in browsers, came out with P3P and P3P compact policies and letting you decide to your statement, if you trust me when I say don't trust me. And they allowed people to. It went up to a 3% adoption. It's now down to about a 0.6% adoption. What makes you think that this is going to be any different? We're a small community when it comes to the internet at large.
Okay, so has anyone actually bought the P3P book just before we start? Anyone? One? Okay, good.